The Committee on House Administration will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair may declare recess at any time. Also, without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 legislative days. Some members may submit any material they wish to be included therein. Thank you, Ranking Member Morelli, members of the committee, and our witnesses for participating in today's panel. When drafting the Constitution, the Founding Fathers created the legislative branch under Article 1 and created the People's House. Our founders envisioned Congress to be the most powerful branch of the federal government. Yet in recent years, we've seen Congress become possibly the weakest of the 3 branches. Last month, the Supreme Court decided that must change. In 1982, the Supreme Court made a mistake establishing the Chevron doctrine. In Chevron v. NRDC, the court established the Chevron doctrine, concluding that the court should defer to unelected federal bureaucrats for implicit statutory interpretation. For 40 years, federal agencies have interpreted and implemented laws based on their own definitions, sometimes unaligned with congressional intent. Under Chevron, executive branch agencies had the central role in interpreting federal statutes. In turn, it took power away from Congress and allowed unelected federal bureaucrats to make decisions that impacted hundreds of millions of Americans. Last month, the Supreme Court changed course. In the Loper-Bright case, the court overturned the Chevron doctrine and placed the lawmaking power back where it belongs, with us in Congress. The justices agreed that many of the concerns we in Congress have voiced, the Supreme Court agreed with many of the concerns we had voiced for decades here in Congress. In his concurring opinion, Justice Thomas wrote, quote, "By giving the force of law to agency pronouncements on matters of private conduct as to which Congress did not actually have an intent, Chevron permits a body other than Congress to perform a function that requires an exercise of legislative power." In the concurring opinion, Justice Gorsuch explained, quote, "Even its most ardent defenders have conceded Chevron deference rests upon a fictionalized statement of legislative desire, namely a judicial supposition that Congress implicitly wishes judges to defer to executive agencies, interpretations of the law, even when it said nothing of the kind." The Supreme Court decision in Loper-Bright overturning the Chevron doctrine correctly restores legislative power where the Constitution actually assigns it, in the legislative branch. Now it's our opportunity to explore how we leverage the Supreme Court's ruling. Without action, we run the risk to continue to grow the administrative state. We must rein in the administrative state. Let's look at the facts. There's 439 executive branch agencies that have the authority to issue and enforce federal regulations. There's 2.2 million non-military executive branch employees. There are over 200,000 pages in the Federal Code of Regulations. In fact, the Biden administration published over 90,000 pages in the Federal Register last year. For context, the Bible is 1,200 pages. That means the Biden administration has added roughly 80 Bibles worth of material in just 1 year. The Biden administration's regulations have cost taxpayers an estimated $1.4 trillion since he took office. So how can Congress address the growing administrative states? What are the first steps we should take? Today we'll talk about how and when Congress should engage in the rulemaking process, Congress's capacity to do so, and more. For decades, the model was simple. Congress established the policies by passing laws, and agencies provided technical expertise through the rulemaking process. But the agencies have gone far beyond providing technical expertise. Now that the Supreme Court has correctly overturned the Chevron deference doctrine, we must begin restoring power to the legislative branch. This is our opportunity to ask important questions about the structure of Congress, now that our role in the rulemaking process has been reestablished. In the Loper-Bright decision, the Supreme Court has provided a real opportunity for Congress to restore itself to the People's House once again. I look forward to a robust discussion on the important topic today. I'm going to recognize Ranking Member Morelli in just a second. We obviously have votes coming up, so just in an operations standpoint, we're going to go until we determine we have to head to the floor. We'll take a brief recess, and we will return. And so now I will recognize Ranking Member Morelli for 5 minutes for the purpose of providing an opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Stile. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Too frequently in recent years, the conservative majority on the United States Supreme Court has reversed longstanding legal precedent. These decisions have harmed the American public. Take, for example, the conservative majority's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade and restrict reproductive freedom in America. Or in another instance, this court further eroded the ability for Americans of color to cast a free, fair, and meaningful ballot. Most recently, the extreme conservatives on the Supreme Court reversed the 1984 Chevron v. Natural Resources Defense Council decision, which allowed the government to implement reasonable regulations within their expertise. This decision is what we are here to discuss today. Chevron stood for the common sense proposition that Congress and the executive branch should be the primary policymakers in government because they are accountable to the people through the ballot box. The power rests with the people, not an unelected court. Congress empowers the executive branch to make certain policy choices. These choices are often involve scientific or technical subjects about which agencies have greater expertise than Congress and the courts. In reversing Chevron, however, the Supreme Court makes it more difficult for Congress to exercise its power. In an instant, the conservative majority in the Supreme Court substituted its policymaking judgment for the elected branches of government. The American people will suffer as a result. And let's be crystal clear, this decision did not empower Congress. I strongly disagree with my friend and chair, Mr. Stile. It empowered the conservative majority in the Supreme Court and a legion of Federal Society-vetted lower court judges to make extreme and ill-informed decisions impacting every American's daily life. Further, the decision is a tremendous gift to the wealthy and to special interests. Corporations will bend over backward to find cases to undo existing regulations protecting the food and drugs our children consume, the quality of the air we all breathe, and the cleanliness of the water our families drink. Imagine weaker regulations on baby food and baby formula. Imagine weaker regulations on brake pads for our cars. Imagine weaker regulations for air travel and traffic control. This decision will inhibit sensible regulation of especially technical policy areas, including nuclear power, artificial intelligence, climate and the climate crisis, and so much more. It's important to understand that this extreme decision also plays into the MAGA Republicans' playbook. If Republicans are successful this November, they will unleash Trump's Project 2025 on the American people. We know the harm Trump's Project 2025 will cause. By mass firing civil servants, like the people who work every day to ensure our produce is not rotting and our meat is not putrid, Trump's Project 2025 will further threaten the government's expertise to address the most pressing issues of our day. Reversing Chevron and implementing Trump's Project 2025 are interconnected. Look no further than today's hearing, which includes a witness called by the Republican majority who was recognized for, quote, devoting a significant amount of valuable time to reviewing and editing Project 2025 and for providing expert advice and insight on the project. So here we are. In Congress, we are left to deal with the fallout. Even before the decision is documented by the Bipartisan Select Committee on Modernization, led by our colleague, Representative Derek Kilmer in the previous Congress, Congress desperately needed an infusion of resources, capacity, and expertise. Now the need is more urgent. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are serious about preparing us for a post-Chevron existence, we need to approve an adequate legislative branch appropriations bill. The Republican majority embarrassingly failed to pass the legislative appropriations bill last week because they refused to work in a bipartisan manner to prioritize our constituents and this Article I institution. Even after catering to extreme MAGA Republicans in the legislative branch subcommittee, markup, and then during committee at the full committee, of which I am a member, all that pandering was for nothing. Extreme MAGA Republicans defeated the appropriations bill on the floor, which funds offices like the Office of Legislative Counsel, the Parliamentarian, the Congressional Research Service, not because the bill did too little, but because they believe it provides too much. We know what we need to do because we've done it before. I'm proud of the recent improvements made during a Democratic control of the House to recruit and retain skilled staff, spearheaded by this committee. That included imposing the first ever minimum pay rate for full-time House staff, decoupling member pay and staff pay, which allowed us to raise the staff pay cap and retain subject matter experts and policy drafters, expanding benefits like the student loan repayment program, increasing resources for Congressional Staff Academy, and the coach program. To meet the moment, we need to be clear-eyed about how significant an investment is required. This committee is well-positioned to lead. I hope we can do so in a bipartisan fashion. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Today we have a one-witness panel. The Honorable Paul J. Ray, former Associate Director of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs that is housed within the Executive Branch's Office of Management and Budget, where he supervised in review of hundreds of regulations. He now leads the Heritage Foundation's work on regulatory and economic policy as director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Mr. Satya Thallam is a former senior advisor at OIRA and is now the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for Americans for Responsible Innovation. He's a policy expert and advisor, having served in senior roles in the congressional and executive branches, and is an executive at a biotechnology startup. Dr. Kevin Kosar is a resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies Congress, congressional oversight, and the administrative state. Dr. Kosar has written several books, spent more than a decade working for the Congressional Research Service, and has previously testified before our Modernization Subcommittee. Mr. Wayne Cruz is the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulatory Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. His work explores the impact of government regulation of free enterprise. Mr. Cruz has authored numerous works, such as the annual report titled 10,000 Commandments, an annual snapshot of the federal regulatory state. Professor Josh Chafetz is an Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial Professor of Law and Politics at the Georgetown University Law Center. Professor Chafetz has multiple publications, including his book titled Congress's Constitution, Legislative Authority, and the Separation of Powers. We appreciate you being with us today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Let me remind the witnesses that we've read your written statements and they'll appear in full in the hearing record. Under Committee Rule 9, you're to limit your oral presentation to a brief summary of your written remarks. We are going to take a brief pause at the committee before we begin opening remarks. I'd remind the members they have told us that they are going to gavel down the first vote at a hard 20 minutes. We'll see if that's the case. Following the 4 votes, we will return promptly. The committee stands in recess.
Thank you.
Where we left off, I will now recognize the Honorable Paul Ray for 5 minutes for the purpose of giving an opening statement.
Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to appear here today. Thank you for the invitation. I direct the Heritage Foundation's Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. From June 2018 through January 2021, I served in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB. For the last year of that period, I had a double honor to serve as administrator of OIRA and to work with Satya here to my right. While at OIRA, I had the chance to form views about many of the ways our regulatory system succeeds and fails. The views I express here are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Today's topic, the relationship of Congress to the agencies, is a vast one. Every year, many bills are introduced to modify this relationship. Today, I would like to offer some thoughts on an overarching framework for evaluating such bills. I'd like to argue that the founders intended Congress to provide not just representation, but a certain sort of representation, one that imports into the legislative process certain qualities that Congress and Congress alone can offer. Congress should favor bills that inject these qualities into the administrative process. The Loper-Bright and relentless decisions have made it easier for Congress to play its role successfully, though ultimately that success has to come down to the actions of Congress itself. In 1788, founding father John Dickinson wrote that under the newly proposed American Constitution, quote, the whole people of the United States are to be trebly represented in 3 different modes of representation. Each branch of the new government would represent the people in its own unique way. Congress was to channel the people's wisdom and justice, the president their energy, and the courts their judgment. The Constitution brings these 3 modes of representation together in an arrangement that puts to use the qualities of each. The founders intended Congress to offer qualities that the president and the courts do not. Congress was meant to be the people in miniature. In John Adams' words, it would think, feel, reason, and act like the people. Elections are, of course, one principal way of achieving this goal, but there are others. The founders believed it crucial that members of Congress feel the effects of their legislation in precisely the same way the people do. They emphasized that members of Congress would be subject to the laws they enact, just like the people, and so would share a, quote, communion of interests and sympathy of sentiments with the people, as the Federalist Papers put it. The separation of powers preserves that communion, for by barring Congress from enhancing its own powers through legislation, it prevents the distorting incentives to which such a possibility would give rise. These arrangements serve to channel the people's views into legislation. But as the founders discovered during the turbulent first years of independence, the people is no monolithic entity. It comprises a vast diversity of interest and opinion groups, some of which are all too willing to use state power to exploit their opponents. The founders' solution to this problem relied on these very same diverse interest and opinion groups. To garner a majority of votes, legislation must attract the support of many disparate factions, and so must appeal either to interests most or all Americans share, or to our common sense of justice. And while it's also possible for legislation to achieve passage based on its appeal to a majority coalition of factions, the multipolar legislative process was intended to make the transaction costs of forging coalitions like this prohibitively high. Now, administrative agencies are not set up to offer the benefits of legislative representation. There are 2 main models of administration, which we can call bureaucratic and presidential. On the bureaucratic side, agencies are supposed to operate rather like policy courts. Indeed, early advocates analogized the agencies to courts and argued they should receive the same kinds of protections for their independence that courts enjoy. The problem with the analogy is that statutes often leave substantial policy discretion to the agencies. So agencies, unlike courts, must set policy. But Article III style representation is hopelessly ill-suited to channel the people's policy views. For one thing, agency officials are unelected, nor do they live under the regulations they issue. To the contrary, agencies can enhance their own powers through their regulations, which can sometimes give them interests that are opposite to the people's, notwithstanding the best efforts of the agency staff. Nor can presidential administration supply the qualities of legislative representation. This is mainly because presidential unity exposes the presidential decision-making process to capture by interest and opinion groups which can obtain the executive action they want without persuading representatives of many diverse factions, as they must under Article I. Presidential supervision of administrative agencies has much to be said for it, but one thing that cannot be said for it is that it can substitute for Congress's own role. Of currently pending legislation, the REINS Act would go furthest toward reviving legislative representation in the context of the administrative state. The Act would in large part subject major regulations to the Article I process with its electoral responsiveness, separation of powers, anti-faction protections, and stability-promoting features. More broadly, Congress's role with respect to the agencies should be to inject into the process those qualities that legislative representation was intended to provide. Loper Bright and Relentless can help Congress to do so by lowering the transaction costs of enacting legislative text that limits agency discretion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize you, Mr. Satya Thallam, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'll apologize up front. I lost my voice a couple days ago, and so now I'm relegated to sounding like Wilford Brimley or something. Or the coach from Major League. My name is Satya Thallam, Senior VP at Americans Responsible Innovation, Senior Fellow at Foundation for American Innovation, and perhaps most pertinent for this hearing, for a number of years, I was a senior staffer at the Senate committee that had primary jurisdiction over the Administrative Procedure Act and all regulatory process-related issues, and later worked at OIRA, which Paul mentioned. So in this testimony, I hope to make 3 basic points. First, if you'll pardon the slightly obtuse metaphor, federal policymaking follows something like the first law of thermodynamics. Energy in the system can move between different parts or change form, but it is neither created nor destroyed. What this means is if one branch does not energetically exploit its prerogative to make policy decisions, those policy decisions will be made elsewhere by the other branches. Like a balloon, squeezing on one part will simply move the gas to another area. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, as Madison said, but apathy is not met with symmetrical apathy. What the court has done has used its own prerogative to reassert a new equilibrium. And yes, this has the effect of empowering the Article I branch, but this effect is not self-executing. It is right now a kind of potential energy, waiting for a force to be applied, turning it into kinetic energy, to further torture my classical mechanics metaphor. Second, let us remember that the original Chevron decision itself ultimately permitted agency discretion in that case, and what most people agreed was a deregulatory direction. The EPA had wanted to permit more flexibility in regulatory compliance, making an existing rule less constraining. So the Chevron decision, not the most recent decision, but the original Chevron decision, and now Loper Bright are neither, quote, regulatory or deregulatory. This formulation makes no sense. Further on this point, the APA does not contemplate a thing called a, quote, deregulation as something afforded a differential process. The APA defines rulemaking as, quote, agency process for formulating, amending, or repealing a rule. In other words, everything, any change to the Code of Federal Regulations is similarly situated and is not tilted in favor of one or the other. Third point, and I believe at least some, if not all of my colleagues on this panel will agree with this, with the need, maybe not even limited to responding to this decision, to increase congressional capacity. As the sole branch of government constitutionally vested with legislative powers, it behooves Congress to be best equipped to execute that responsibility. In naive terms, Congress is worse off. Since this decision, contrary to the hearing's title, is actually a return to the pre-Chevron regime, let's go back. In the 40 years since the decision, the total number of congressional staff has actually decreased, has actually gone down by a few percent. In the last 30 years, the number of committee staff has gone down by 40%. Does anyone on the committee believe Congress's work has become less complicated, confusing, and therefore easier since then? Members of Congress may be wary of the self-aggrandizing appearance of accumulating more staff, but human capital and expertise are embodied in people, and this kind of a decrease in intellectual capacity has only one result in terms of productivity and effectiveness. This is admittedly a crude measurement of congressional capacity, but I hope you get the point. Finally, an anecdote on this capacity on a slightly related thing. Many of you are familiar with the Congressional Review Act, and its requirement that a report be submitted to Congress for review for every new rule. Well, in 2020, for obvious reasons, the normal processes for submitting those reports, which at the time were all done by hard copy, were severely challenged. When I inquired with various offices to find a solution, like submitting those reports electronically, therefore they'd have a timestamp of the receipt and then follow up with hard copies, I was told emphatically, we do not have the capacity to set up such a system. I don't want to be too precious about this point, but if Congress hasn't made even modest administrative updates to fairly mundane processes, how can we believe Congress is equipped to handle an increasingly complex, unpredictable, and fast-moving 21st century? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Now recognize you, Mr. Kevin Kosar, for 5 minutes.
All righty. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you for having me in. I'm honored to be before you. Well, I'll limit myself to 2 points. The first of which is evident, but there's been a lot of hyperbolic commentary online and in the media. The court's decision in Loper Bright and the relentless cases didn't end regulation. They didn't slay the administrative state. Agencies will continue to interpret the law and to issue regulation and guidance and all those sorts of documents to try to apply statutes. So this leads me to point number 2, which my friend has well set up. Congress doesn't really have an oversight apparatus to ensure that when the executive branch engages in regulatory actions, that their actions comport with the law. Article 1 of the Constitution, as has been said, confers all legislative authority, all lawmaking authority to this institution, Congress. Article 2 says, the President shall take care that the law be faithfully executed. Well, how do you ensure that the law is being faithfully executed? Over the course of the last century, as the scope of federal activities has grown, Congress has made various ad hoc investments in itself to do that. It's, for example, 100 years ago, created the General Accounting Office, GAO, to follow the money and ensure money was not being spent outside the bounds set by appropriations acts. It created inspectors general to keep an eye on agency personnel.
Mr. Kosar, I'm getting a note that it's a little difficult to hear you on the stream. We can hear you in the room just fine, but I know we have a lot of people listening. If you just want to pull that microphone a little closer, because I want to make sure
how's
everybody
that?
online can hear. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So yeah, you also created inspectors general in order to keep an eye on agency personnel and make sure they weren't acting outside of the law. But nothing has been built to help you all oversee regulation and ensure that it's being done in a way that is within the bounds of the law. And today, regulation is a massive part of policymaking. As noted in your introductory statement, we have 439 agencies, and there are a few thousand rules being issued every year, some small, some large, but that's a lot of work, and nobody is directly tasked with doing it. And so, you know, I come to you, a conservative who believes in constitutional government, reviving federalism, smaller government, all those sort of traditional conservative values, and I am saying, please create a congressional regulation office. Whether it's a freestanding office, whether it's an office you tuck inside the Congressional Budget Office, is not something that matters to me. But 20 years in DC, it's been my perception that if you want something to get done, you have to task somebody with doing it. And I see you all working frantically. I see your staffs working especially frantically. So many things to do, so much to oversee, so much coming at you. How you can fruitfully engage regulatory actions at this point, I don't think you can. The capacity is just not there. And so creating a core of folks who have legal skills, policy chops, but also statistical analysis skills, who can look at the executive branch as it moves through the regulatory process, you know, from snout to tail, and ensure that what they're doing is within the law. This is a core of folks who could help maintain a dialogue for the Congress with the executive branch as it goes through the process, as it works through these nettlesome, complicated issues and these deals with these unforeseen things that were probably not even on your mind as you passed the bill. With that, you know what? I've got 50 seconds left. I'm just going to give back my time, and thank you for hearing me.
Unprecedented. The gentleman yields back. Mr. Wayne Cruz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on Congress's role in a post-Chevron world. My name is Wayne Cruz. I'm the Fred L. Smith Fellow in Regulatory Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Federal spending hogs the spotlight, but the hidden tax of regulation affects every aspect of our lives. The Code of Federal Regulations tops 188,000 pages. Last year alone, agencies issued 3,000 rules compared to just 65 laws passed by Congress. Costs remain unaccounted for, notably those from independent agencies now ascendant in whole-of-government pursuits like net zero energy, AI, equity, and competition policy. Congress must reclaim its lawmaking authority from the executive branch, but first and foremost, it must restrain its own interventionist appetites. There are many elements to this in my written remarks, but they all require that Congress, and this committee in particular, marshal appropriate resources and personnel to perform rigorous regulatory oversight and disclosures, replacing the eroded White House variant. The end of Chevron deference marks an overdue reaffirmation of separation of powers and a break on overdelegation. However, it's crucial to recognize the extent to which regulatory advocates will mobilize in response. While extraordinary extensions of regulatory power occurred during Chevron's reign, most of the leverageable administrative apparatus was erected before then. Especially since COVID, the problem is less about agency interpretation of the ambiguous statutes at hand in Loper than agencies' implementation of unambiguous statutes. The Inflation, Infrastructure, and CHIPS laws are exceedingly regulatory even before administrators pick up a pencil. Workarounds exist for regulatory advocates to exploit in a post-Chevron world, including 1, more coordination on potent, unambiguous, and purpose-driven legislation like the CARES Act and the TikTok ban. 2, seducing the private sector with subsidies, grants, and partnerships to embrace interventionist legislation and cartelization. 3, increasing federal influence with hundreds of billions in procurement and contracting. And 4, replacing notice and comment rules with guidance documents and other forms of regulatory dark matter. To prepare, an outstanding but neglected new GAO report provides recommendations that this committee should heed, up to and including establishing a Congressional Office of Regulatory Analysis. Done correctly, a CORA could challenge mistaken presumptions of agency expertise and avoid the faulty presumption that market failure outweighs political failure. To reinforce GAO, other needed steps include overturning Biden's rewrite of OMB's Circular A4 and ensuring that regulatory reform laws already in effect but disregarded get enforced. Next comes the pursuit of several new legislative reforms. 1, passing the REINS Act, ideally under its predecessor's superior name, the Congressional Responsibility Act. 2, taking up the Democrats on their marvelous regulatory budgeting idea. 3, creating a regulatory reduction commission. 4, reinstating one-in, one-out policies and sunsetting regulations. 5th, and most importantly, reforms in the use of agency sub-regulatory guidance documents, including banning them. 6th, the low-hanging fruit should be the annual regulatory reporting in the style of the federal budget's historical tables. A generation ago, a slate of regulatory reforms benefiting state and local government, small business, and consumers passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. But today's fusion of hyperspending and regulation, government steers while the market merely rose, as our founder Fred Smith puts it. Cost of intervention compound even without writing notice and comment rules. Correcting overdelegation is vital, but the real challenge is Congress's own disregard for enumerated powers. Response requires decentralizations, federalism, and ending the abuse of crises like happened with COVID and the financial meltdown. By enhancing resources and fostering reforms, this committee could play a key role in limiting overregulation and expanding jobs and wealth. You don't need to tell the grass to grow, you just have to take the rocks off of it. Thank you again, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Josh Chafetz, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the vitally important topic of congressional responses to the Supreme Court's recent Loper-Bright decision, which ended the practice of according Chevron deference to agencies' interpretations of the statutes that they administer. Let me begin with a few words about the likely effects of Loper-Bright. First, it's likely to lead to more judicial policymaking. The largest study of agency statutory interpretation cases in the circuit courts found that use of Chevron deference significantly reduced ideological decision-making by judges. In pre-Loper-Bright cases where Chevron deference was not applied, political preferences played a much larger role in case outcomes. So one thing we can say about Loper-Bright is that it will very likely free the hands of judges to dispense with regulations that they dislike. Indeed, we should see Loper-Bright as part of a larger project by the Roberts Court of judicial self-aggrandizement across administrative law and beyond. In contexts ranging from the removability of agency officials, to the availability of in-house agency adjudication, to the so-called major questions doctrine and more, the court has repeatedly undermined the regulatory regimes that Congress has put in place. In their stead, the court has substituted its own preferences as to how government should be constructed and what policies it may enact. Loper-Bright ignores research demonstrating that Chevron was the interpretive tool most familiar to congressional drafters, far more so than canons relied upon by the Supreme Court with some regularity. Drafters were well aware that statutory ambiguity would be interpreted as a delegation of interpretive authority to the agency, and if they didn't want that agency to have that authority, they attempted to draft with greater specificity. Eliminating a doctrine in whose shadow Congress has drafted for decades and replacing it with something significantly less certain in its operation is not congressional empowerment, it's judicial empowerment. Agencies, seeing this posture by the courts, are likely to respond by preemptively trimming their sails, issuing only those regulations that they think are likely to meet with judicial approval, and refraining from altering old interpretations even as new information and new technologies become available. The flexibility that's a hallmark of the administrative state, the flexibility that Congress has designed into the administrative state, will be substantially undermined, all under the flag of supposedly empowering Congress. So what can Congress do to respond to this judicial power grab? Well, first, in the realm of bill drafting, Congress can write deference into individual bills empowering agencies, or it could even draft a standalone bill reinstituting Chevron deference. Because Loper-Bright claims to be an interpretation of the Administrative Procedure Act, not a constitutional holding, it can be reversed by statute. Congress could also choose to draft in ways that clearly indicate that it's vesting significant discretion in agencies, using words like reasonable or appropriate. This, too, would be consistent with the language of the Loper-Bright decision. Of course, just because these drafting techniques would be consistent with the facial reasoning of Loper-Bright doesn't mean that the court wouldn't find other ways to skirt them or strike them down. The general anti-administrative posture of the current court should make us skeptical that it will allow Congress to assert itself in these ways. The other category of responses to Loper-Bright falls under the heading of congressional capacity building, and here's an area in which I think possibly all of us on this panel agree. If the court is going to insist that Congress make policy at ever more granular levels, then Congress will need to build an institutional infrastructure mirroring that which currently exists at the agencies. This means large increases in the number of staffers and diversifying the experience of staffers, including hiring many with graduate degrees in the social and physical sciences and many more with security clearances. It means paying those staffers well enough to retain them, and giving them access to resources like sophisticated information technology, databases, and perhaps even in some cases laboratories. The proposals put forward by the Modernization Committee, some of which have been adopted, would be a step in the right direction, but only a step. And even a massive increase in congressional capacity could never fully substitute for administrative expertise. There's a reason that no modern democratic system that I'm aware of has its legislature making policy at the level of granularity at which agencies regulate. Moreover, many governance decisions in the executive branch are specific to circumstances that arise after implementation has already begun. Asking Congress to resolve those issues ex ante is unlikely to succeed. In summary, the Supreme Court in Loper-Bright, but also more broadly across Roberts Court administrative law decisions, has made it harder and harder for agencies to pursue the missions that Congress has assigned them. These decisions taking power away from agencies do not, the claims of their authors notwithstanding, empower Congress. Rather, they empower the courts at the expense of both Congress and the agencies. There are strategies available for Congress to respond, including both bill drafting techniques and institutional capacity building, and these are absolutely worth pursuing. But at the end of the day, their impact will be limited. As long as the judiciary has an anti-administrativist bent, making pro-regulatory public policy will remain very much an uphill climb. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We thank all of our witnesses. I'll begin with questions. We'll then go to the ranking member. We'll alternate. between sides. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. The Committee on House Administration, we oversee the legislative branch and authorize committee budgets. The Supreme Court decision in Loper-Bright sent a clear message that lawmaking authority rests with Congress. In the wake of that decision, this committee has a real opportunity to ensure that Congress leverages its resources effectively. So out of the gates, question, I'm going to come down the row, starting with you, Mr. Ray, and we'll come down. As currently structured, is Congress set up to review the rules coming out of the administrative state? Yes or no?
No.
Mr. Thallam?
No.
No.
So, no. So then the question becomes, how do we restructure Congress to take advantage of this opportunity that's been given to us to reclaim authority, and it's been given to us by the Supreme Court? And what I'd love is just to go down the row. I'm looking for a short-term answer. What can we do in the near term? And I want to come through and ask, what can we do in the long term? So short-term first is something that is actually accomplishable in the short term as we think about the structure of Congress. Mr. Ray?
In the short term, hire more staff with relevant subject matter expertise.
I think even easier than that, empower GAO, assign a task force to look into doing a pilot project along these lines.
I'd be inclined to say hire staff that can work within the CBO and who can kind of pilot this idea of providing regulatory oversight support.
Most of the regulatory reform reports you're supposed to be getting are overdue, so you can quickly work with judiciary and OGR and get the annual, but it comes out every 3 years, cost for benefit report. You can get the paperwork reduction report. It's 16,000 human lives in paperwork hours every year. And also just making sure that the CRA in particular is followed. If you look at the flow of rules at the GAO, not every major rule is getting reported, and I don't know how in the world you would determine whether those rules are being reported to you all. I don't think there's a single person who can tell you that they are. A little bit in the congressional record on communications with the executive branch, but that's the quick stuff to scoop up.
Thank you. Mr. Chafetz?
Committees already have the obligation to conduct oversight of all of the functions within their jurisdiction. So beefing up committee staff, and in particular committee staff with substantive expertise in the areas that they're overseeing, would allow them to evaluate the regulations coming out of the executive branch.
Thank you. I'm going to come back for a slightly more of a longer-term look as to how you think we should be thinking about the long-term restructuring to reestablish congressional control over the administrative state. Mr. Ray?
I don't see a way for Congress to reestablish control so long as it is in a fundamentally responsive posture to the agencies and the executive branch generally. So the key, to my way of thinking, is for Congress to again become the first mover it was intended to be under the Constitution. There are various ways to do that. One would be to pass something like the REINS Act, which requires for some subset of the most important regulations affirmative congressional approval rather than congressional response.
Thank you. Mr. Thallam?
So similarly to how the White House has a extensive budget office and Congress does as well, we don't view that as duplicative. We find that those are both essential elements that Congress not rely on it. I think it's appropriate to, in the long term, determine how to set up a regulatory office given actually the scope of the work is something akin to maybe even larger than the budget work.
Thank you.
Precisely what he said.
You're concise, Mr. Kosar. I like it.
I support REINS in the congressional office like this too, but I would urge you all to look at each other and what you worked on in the past. The last time you had major regulatory reforms was a generation ago when you did the unfunded mandates, the small business, the paperwork amendments, and even the CRA. It was Harry Reid of Nevada leading the charge for the Congressional Review Act. That would astound you now to think that. But what was happening at the time was unfunded mandates on state and local governments and small business that got everyone's attention in this room. That's not happening now because those mandates are funded through infrastructure law, inflation law, CHIPS law, and they've got a lot of regulatory strings attached with regulatory dark matter and so forth. But eventually that money dries up. So I would say a lot of the ideas that you have are bipartisan. So longer term, regulatory budgeting, sunsetting, oversight, that sort of thing. There's a lot of that stuff that you all have worked together on the past on, and you can do that again.
Very concisely, Mr. Chafetz.
I'm a little more skeptical than some of my colleagues of an office that's specifically designed to focus on regulation. I think, again, I'm not sure they would have the substantive expertise to review regulations coming from all the different parts of the administrative state. So again, I would urge long-term capacity building in the committees that already exist.
Thank you very much. I think we have a real unique opportunity here, post-end of the Chevron doctrine, to really reestablish Congress as the primary maker of both law and an overview of the regulation. I think the REINS Act would move us dramatically in that direction. Appreciate all of our witnesses for being here today. I'll now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. You know, I feel a little bit like I'm watching one of my favorite programs on TV is Love It or List It. This is on HGTV. So it's always in the couple, one of them wants to sell the house, and one of them wants to buy, and one of them wants to stay. The person who wants to move, when they say, well, what's your perfect house? How could we make this one better so you'd be inclined to stay? They say, well, and then they list about 45 things that would cost like $1 million. And they say, what's the budget? Oh, 100,000. So you're set up to fail. You can't actually do it. So while I appreciate the sincerity of the members, I just note a couple of things. When it comes to hiring more staff or building the legislative branch, which, believe me, I would go on record, I would triple the House the congressional appropriation. I think we are woefully underfunded, so I do agree with you. But just to note, the appropriations proposed by the House in total, non-mandated appropriations proposed by the House right now is $1.606 trillion. The amount proposed for the legislative branch is $7 billion, or, for those of you who appreciate math, 0.4% of the entire federal non-mandated spend proposed in this bill. It failed on the House floor last week because it's too expensive, too rich, so it couldn't get enough votes for passage. So I feel, again, like that, yeah, oh yeah, here, it would only cost $3 million to do this thing, but you only have $100,000. I, for the life of me, don't understand how this would work. I appreciate you, which leads me, and I'll ask you Mr. Chafetz, is that, am I pronouncing that right?
Chafetz, yeah.
Chafetz. So you had mentioned in your testimony that rather than empowering Congress, Loper-Bright empowers courts at the expense of Congress. Is that, can you just expand upon that a little bit, how it degrades congressional authority over federal agencies? Is it purely because of what I just mentioned, the lack of resources, or do you want to go beyond that in terms of why it shifts the balance of power?
Sure. So, you know, when Congress, first of all, Congress has created these agencies. Congress has passed their organic statutes. Congress has delegated authority to these agencies. And since 1984, Congress has done so in the shadow of Chevron deference. And this isn't just a hypothetical. We have, you know, really solid research showing that Chevron deference is the tool most understood by congressional drafters, by staff in Ledge Council, and by staff sort of elsewhere on the Hill. They understood they were drafting these statutes in light of Chevron deference, and they understood that if they didn't want the agencies to have interpretive freedom, that they should draft with more specificity, and so they did. So what that means is that by taking this away, essentially the courts are saying, you know, this thing that Congress thought it was delegating to agencies, which is this interpretive freedom, in fact, the agencies don't get to have that. And what replaces that is not, you know, power flowing back to this institution. What replaces that is the courts giving their own sort of de novo interpretations of these statutory regimes, right? So it's not passing from unaccountable bureaucrats to the accountable Congress. It's passing from somewhat accountable bureaucrats to even less accountable federal judges.
Thank you for that. I want to shift just for a second. Again, Professor, we're here to consider ways Congress can better serve the American people. Americans agree government should use its power to protect health and well-being, grow the economy, and grow the prosperity of all Americans. I want to read something from Project 25 that is associated with former President Trump. It says that the president has, quote, an existential need for aggressive use of the vast powers of the executive branch. Success in meeting that challenge will require boldness to bend or break the bureaucracy to the presidential will. Among the recommendations, the mass firing of civil servants, many of whom, frankly, do the protection of health and well-being that I mentioned, When a buzz saw that former President Trump's Project 2025 takes to civil service keep Americans safe from the dangers such as, I mentioned things that the FDA does, for instance, that our administrative system currently protects. Can you talk about what that impact could potentially have?
Sure. So, for the entire 19th century, we didn't have civil service protections in this country, and we had what was known as the spoils system, where every time a new administration came into power, they would fire basically every federal employee and replace them with members of their own party. This was widely regarded as one of the worst governance systems in the world. You see criticism, you see sort of scholars in Europe sort of laughing at this throughout the 19th century. Finally, as the American state sort of grows in sophistication, toward the very end of the 19th century and into the 20th, it begins implementing civil service reforms, becoming a sort of modern administrative nation. And so sort of undoing civil service protections, right, returning to a spoils system would sort of return us to a lot of the sort of waste and abuse that really characterized 19th century American politics.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Loudermilk's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a very interesting subject matter, something I've been working on since I first came to Congress. And a little bit of follow-up on what Mr. Chafetz was just saying in the interaction there. We do have an issue within the civil service system. There is such protection that it takes up to 2 years to fire a bad employee. That is something that has to be addressed. This is a bipartisan issue. I first learned of this from President Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, who was begging for things to be changed because they're keeping employees who basically had committed crimes or had disciplinary actions so bad that they could not remove them from the payroll. They couldn't continue to do their job because they couldn't keep a security clearance, but they had to keep on the payroll for a year, and if they appealed, then it was another year. And so he said, we're paying people that are basically getting 2 years of unpaid vacation with full benefits. This has to change. This has to change. And so I just wanted to bring that up, is it's not going back to the old system. And I don't know what is in Project 25, but I have legislation that would bring in sensible ways of streamlining civil service and making sure that they are productive and they are doing their jobs and they're just not getting a free ride off the American taxpayer. So I think we do have to be intellectually honest as we talk about these issues. But to the issue at hand, this is something that I've been working on since I came to Congress. Myself, Senator Mike Lee, and then Congressman Jeb Hensarling put together the Article 1 project, which is to rebalance the powers which the majority are given to Congress. And we saw at the time that there's an extensive amount of power since World War II that have been extended to the executive branch. And it was interesting. I was having a dinner with Justice Scalia one evening, and we were talking about this, and I asked him, what can we do to eliminate or to rein in the executive branch from legislating via regulation and the courts from legislating from the bench? And his response was, Congress needs to do its job. You need to write legislation with more specificity. And so this is the type of thing, this is good timing. And, Chevron deference was one of the issues that we were facing at the time. And my understanding has always been that when an act of government can deprive citizens of property or liberty, it is not a rule or regulation, it's a law. And only Congress can enact those laws. So with those things on the table there, Mr. Ray, what specific accountability measures should Congress adopt to ensure that federal agencies adhere strictly to legislative intent in both their rulemaking duties and enforcement activities?
I would say, first and foremost, specificity in statutory text, as you just mentioned. Another helpful approach is to specify the outcomes that Congress is after. Right? When agencies are left great discretion, they can pick and choose among the outcomes to optimize for. When Congress specifies we want the following outcomes in this particular order, then that constrains agency discretion in a pretty serious way.
Do you feel like, for us to give specificity in legislation, which I think we should, sometimes we're handcuffed because we don't necessarily have the experts in the field that I'd make the argument at one time they were there in the administrative or in the executive branch. I think in the past few decades, political ideology has taken over from expertise as who's appointed in these positions. But is there a way that you can, do you see that handcuffs Congress somewhat, not having experts in fields?
So 2 points in response to the question. First of all, it would certainly be impossible for Congress itself to address the topic of every rulemaking undertaken by the executive branch. There's several hundred rulemakings open for comment right now. But it could answer or resolve a number of the most important rulemakings, right? It could, there's only a few hundred major rulemakings per year typically. It's conceivable that Congress could itself take the initiative in a number of those proceedings. The second point I'd make is that if Congress were to narrow the scope of statutes, then states and other lawmaking bodies across the country could take up some of the work for Congress.
Oh, I like the idea of federalism, and that plays into it. So real quickly, last question. Do you think that there are any mechanisms that we already have in place to do this work, or do we just need a new system and new processes to be created and implemented?
Congress will not be able to exert effective control as long as just responding to agencies. So I think there are some existing systems that could be used effectively today, but really what's called for is a new approach.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for taking the time today to testify. On June 28th, the Supreme Court of the United States overturned 40 years of legal precedent by wiping out the Chevron deference, a doctrine that required courts to defer to subject matter experts when a question of law was ambiguous. This decision will dramatically impact the way that the three branches of government function because it weakens the way federal agencies are able to weigh in on policies about the environment, health care, food, work safety, and so much more. Justice Kagan mentioned in her dissenting opinion that in one fell swoop, the majority, quote, gave exclusive power over every open issue, close quote. This egregious power grab by the Supreme Court is not by happenstance, but rather a larger effort by right-wing conservatives to roll out the Project 2025 agenda that will fundamentally alter the way that government functions. Congress is a team sport, and we rely on staffers, legal counsel, advocates, policy matter experts to create legislation that will impact our constituents' daily lives. But Congress lacks the subject matter expertise it takes to govern our nation alone. Policy matter experts at federal agencies play a very critical role on this team because they can break down the intricate details of how certain regulatory programs and statutes should be administered. Professor Chafetz, it was Justice Stevens who wrote in the original Chevron opinion, quote, "Judges are not experts in the field and are not a part of its either political branch of government. Courts must in some ways reconcile competing political interests, but not on the basis of judges' personal policy preferences." I would suspect that in 40 years, there were a lot of court cases that have been decided using the Chevron deference. Can you talk about how this will open the floodgates to further litigation?
Sure. So, the litigation, I'm not sure to what extent it will, that Loper-Bright on its own will increase the amount of litigation, but it will change the results of some of that litigation. So, there's research showing that Chevron deference made a significant difference in the outcome of circuit court cases. That is, in cases where circuit courts applied Chevron deference, the ideological dispositions of the judges on the three-judge panel mattered less than in cases where it didn't apply Chevron deference. So now that it's not allowed to apply Chevron deference, we should expect to see the ideology of the judges on those three-judge panels mattering more in those cases. I'll also add that there's another case that came down 3 days after Loper-Bright, which is the Corner Post decision.
Yes.
And up until, so the federal law says that there is a 6-year statute of limitations for challenging agency actions. It had always been thought that it was 6 years from the time the agency action was finalized.
Right.
In Corner Post, the Supreme Court says—
And not when the person was injured.
And in Corner Post, right, it says it's 6 years from the time that regulation was applied to that regulated entity, which means that every regulation can now be challenged indefinitely. There's no point at which a regulation has exhausted the.
So what does that mean, coupled with the Chevron deference case?
It means that Corner Post means that there are going to be just a flood of cases that would not have previously been filed, and coupled with Chevron, coupled with Loper-Bright, right? In Loper-Bright, the majority claims that, well, cases that relied on Chevron are still good law. We're not going to reopen those, but those are now available to be challenged again. And if the judges think that there's some error that goes beyond mere reliance on Chevron, then even consistent with Loper-Bright, those longstanding agency interpretations would be open for reevaluation by the courts.
And you said in your testimony that even if Congress bills out our internal team, that it would still be not be able to replace the agencies. How do you think that this will hurt potential policymaking?
Well, it'll make policymaking sort of less robust, less responsive, less likely to sort of address the problems that Congress and that the American people want to address, and less responsive in adapting to changes in scientific knowledge or in technology in order to sort of adjust pre-existing regulations.
Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Torres is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. In recent time, we've seen this conservative, politically motivated and activist Supreme Court overturn settled law like Roe v. Wade, which protected women for almost 50 years. Today, we're discussing yet another dangerous Supreme Court decision which reversed the 40-year old Chevron doctrine, a doctrine that ensured experts in their field had a say in determining complex questions specific to their agencies. This is very dangerous, but overlooked ruling reverses all of that. The result now, instead of experts weighing in on our nation's regulations, we will have unelected judges who do not have policy expertise making decisions that impact our lives. I want to share an example of how this will impact the people that I represent. My district is downwind from Los Angeles, and that has one of the worst air qualities in the nation. According to the American Lung Association, counties in the Inland Empire have some of the worst year-round air quality pollution, and children have far above average rates of asthma and long-term lung problems. Imagine now a world where judges with no background in atmospheric science or lung health will make decisions about what kind of pollutants companies should be allowed to put in our air. I'd like to get some background on, how we've come to the place where we are right now. Mr. Ray, you were specifically thanked in the acknowledgments of Trump's Project 2025, which says that you devoted a significant amount of your valuable time to reviewing and editing a lengthy manuscript and provided expert advice and insight. Is that true?
I did make contributions to the mandate for leadership, if that's the question.
So, yes. Were you compensated in any way for your work in Project 2025? Financially or otherwise? You can't remember? You're again thanked specifically for your work on Chapter 2, titled The Executive Office of the President of the United States. And that chapter says that a great challenge confronting a conservative president is the existential need for aggressive use of the vast powers of the executive branch to bend or break the bureaucracy to the presidential will. That's on page 44. Were you involved in crafting these extreme proposals?
Congressman, I contributed paragraphs to that chapter on OIRA review. I'd be happy to talk about the substance of those paragraphs if you like.
So, yes?
Ma'am, those paragraphs aren't about OIRA review. I contributed paragraphs to that
I
chapter
can't understand
about-
what you're saying, sir. Yes or no?
So I contributed paragraphs to
You
that
did,
chapter
okay.
about OIRA
Project
review,
tw-
and those
Trump
paragraphs are not
Project
about OIRA review.
2025 also contains efforts to promote climate denialism within executive agencies. This includes plans to downsize the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Energy's focus on climate change and break up and reduce the size of NOAA, which the project describes as one of the main drivers of the climate change alarm industry. That's on page 675. And by the way, colleagues, I am also a member of the Appropriations Committee. In the Republican budget, they have included a 25% decrease to this very agency, eliminating this agency. So there is no false alarm here. Dismantling NOAA and its ability to address wildfires and other extreme climate weather is a very real problem for constituents in my district and communities across California. Did you contribute to Project 2025 emphasis on climate denialism and dismantling of the agency powers to combat the very real issue of climate change, Mr. Ray?
Mrs. Torres, I contributed several paragraphs on OIRA review. That was my principal substantive
So
contribution.
your
to the
answer is
project.
yes. Finally, Project 2025 recommends limiting women's access to essential reproductive health care and reproductive freedom. Did you contribute, that's also on page 489, did you contribute to these recommendations?
So again, Congresswoman, my principal contribution to the project in terms of text for the mandate for
Mr.
leadership.
Chair, since the witness has a mouthful of words and no real answers, I would like to request anonymous consent to enter all 922 pages of Trump's Project 2025 into the record so that the American people can see for themselves how deeply terrifying this Trump authoritarian manifesto really is and how it's going to impact the lives of
Without
every
objection,
single man, woman, and child in this country.
Without objection.
Thank you.
We will now commence a second round of questions, and I know we'll have a couple other colleagues, I think, joining in this process. Want to take a second here and dive in. Mr. Cruz, you've done great work kind of walking through the cost of a lot of the regulations that are put out. I'm going to jump, though. I want to ask Mr. Thallam and Mr. Ray, pulling from your experience at OIRA, how should Congress address major rules when they're already final, but the financial impact of the rule isn't realized until years after the regulation is final?
So I would say Congress has already taken steps to achieve that objective by requiring retrospective review, but retrospective review could be enhanced quite significantly. Under the Small Business Regulatory Flexibility Act, agencies are required, with respect to major rules, to go back several years after issuance of the rule and assess the impacts and continued need for the regulation. But agencies regularly skirt that requirement. Congress could do much more to give teeth to the requirement and make the agencies basically participate in that process more robustly.
Thank you. Mr. Thallam?
So along those lines, one proposal that I worked on when I was in the Senate was a bipartisan proposal that would require, as part of the rulemaking itself, a prospective plan to look back within a fixed number of years and conduct that retrospective review, right? So it's not just a future promise, it's actually part of the rule itself has to contain this plan to say within, say, 5 years, the agency will look at the following data, these indicators, to determine to the degree to which the rule is accomplishing both their goal and meeting the intent of Congress. I would also note that we get a little bogged down, I think everyone, in that policymaking is Congress goes first, and then there's this agency action, and then maybe there's a court action later. But it's actually circular, and it's actually a process, and it's not just handing off one. So I spoke to a group of congressional staff on Friday about what this means for their job. Congressional staff should be engaged from the beginning with the agency and not waiting for a proposal to go public.
So I'm going to build on that. So, Mr. Kosar, in your opening remarks, you referenced kind of building out the Congressional Research Office. I'm thinking of other ways that we can pull current staff into this work rather than simply just throwing more money at the problem. Give me a little more color on that idea, what that would look like, or are there areas where we could pull from inside the federal employee group currently, rather than simply allocating additional resources and hiring more people?
Boy, I wish I could point to some legislative branch support agency personnel and say, these folks are not doing enough and they should be repurposed to this more important thing, which is super, super important. But I just can't. You know, when I looked at the numbers, amongst the legislative branch, civil servants who help with policy-related matters, the number of them has gone down since the 1980s, but the federal government's expanse and the regulatory state's gone up, and so like I just can't figure out how to repurpose.
Understood. Does anyone else have an area where they might be able to pull from? We have 2.2 million non-military federal employees. It seems like we should be thinking about an avenue, and if not, I would charge you to all sharpen our pens and to think about inside the rulemaking administrative state whether or not we can reallocate some of those resources back into the congressional side. Mr. Cruz, I'll give it very briefly, and then
Well,
I'm going
just quickly, you were talking about retrospective review. One thing that would force that is if you did some form of sunsetting, which has some bipartisan pedigree that we talked about, and that would help you figure out where you think you actually need to regulate things. You've got economic, social, health and safety, paperwork costs, and things like that. So that would force you to look at some of those things perhaps, and then decide where you ought to regulate. And then remember, most regulations aren't written yet, so unfortunately. So one thing you can think about is what the workloads are in the future. And as Congress takes on more of the authority with writing statutes that are directed the way you want, that helps you too when thinking about what you do on the retrospective basis.
Thank you very much. I'll now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I continue to be really concerned about the size of the capacity of Congress to do it, and particularly given the environment we're in where we haven't been able to pass a legislative appropriation that is so small. But I wanted to, if I could, Professor Chafetz, one of the things, prior to this decision, agencies were able to use existing authorities to issue new rules related to emerging challenges or technologies with relative ease. I know that during the oral argument in Loper-Bright, Justice Kagan expressed that overturning Chevron would hinder agencies' abilities to, I want to get the quote, capture the opportunities, but also meet the challenges of regulating, for instance, artificial intelligence, which, Congress gave the authority to agencies without even knowing what artificial intelligence is. So would we, in some ways, how might the decision affect the ability of agencies to respond quickly to advances in technology like artificial intelligence or other challenges?
Well, so I'd like to begin by noting that agencies can do almost nothing with relative ease, or I suppose you'd have to emphasize relative a great deal, right? Most agency rulemaking takes years. And so the idea that this is something that agencies just sort of pop off and create regulations all the time, I think is somewhat misleading, right? There's a lot of time and effort and conversations that go into producing rulemaking in the first place. But one of the things that Loper-Bright does is says that if agencies want to get any deference at all, even the lesser so-called Skidmore deference, which is basically just sort of respect for the agency's expertise. If they want to take advantage even of that, their interpretation has to remain consistent over time. And this is a problem because facts on the ground change over time. And so when I look back, for example, Representative Loudermilk was referring to Justice Scalia earlier. Justice Scalia was a huge fan of the Chevron decision. When I look back to his major essay praising the Chevron decision, one of the things he praises is its ability to be responsive to changes over time such that agencies don't get locked into their first interpretation. The Supreme Court has now done a 180 on that and said, essentially, if you want even minimal respect for your interpretation, you have to be locked into the first decision you make. AI is a great example. The agencies are just coming to terms with AI now. Who knows what the state of AI will be in 5 or 10 years? It seems crazy to lock them into their initial interpretations at this point.
Just to continue along, even prior to the overturning of Chevron, I think your work has highlighted the recent pattern of what you refer to as judicial self-aggrandizement. This decision would continue that trend, certainly. And I wonder if you could just talk about the broader patterns that you've identified in that regard.
Sure. Well, I think you can see this across a huge number of areas of law, whether we're talking about the Supreme Court's cases on congressional oversight or on election law, but just within administrative law, there are a huge number of ways in which the Roberts Court has sort of taken it upon itself to tell Congress that it's structuring the administrative state wrong. So there have been a bunch of decisions in recent years saying that the way that Congress has structured various agencies is unconstitutional because it limits the removability of certain officers. There have been the major questions doctrine cases, which basically say that the most natural reading of a particular statute won't be allowed to go into effect if the Supreme Court decides that what the agency has done is major. But of course, it gives us no real way of determining whether or not something counts as major. There have been the Jarchese case, right, taking away the ability that Congress had given to agencies to do internal adjudication in some cases. Right? All of these are situations in which Congress tried to create certain structures and forms in the administrative state, and the Supreme Court has come in and said, no, we know better, we're going to undo that, and the administrative state is going to be structured the way we, the court, wants to structure it. In my view, the best label for that is judicial self-aggrandizement.
Yeah, if I can, one of the interesting things about this and much of the conversation that you hear post-Chevron is that prior to this decision, that you couldn't overturn an administrative ruling. But you still had access to the courts prior to Chevron. Do you want to just talk about that for just in the remaining seconds we have?
Absolutely. So Chevron was a two-step test, and step one was if Congress has clearly expressed itself, that's the end of the story, right? If Congress has clearly expressed itself, the agency has to do what Congress says. Only if the statute is silent or ambiguous under Chevron would there be any deference given by the courts. And then beyond that, the Administrative Procedure Act creates a whole host of procedures that the agencies have to go through in order to regulate. And if the courts didn't think that the agencies went through the correct procedures, they could also vacate regulations, right? So it's not that there was unconstrained regulatory authority in the agencies. They had procedural requirements, and of course, if Congress spoke to the issue, they had to do what Congress said. It's only if they went through the correct procedures and Congress had been silent or ambiguous that they got any deference under Chevron.
Very good. And I know I've exceeded my time. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before the committee today. The Supreme Court's recent decision in Loper corrects decades of regulatory overreach by the executive branch and rightfully reasserts the separation of powers as intended by the framers of the Constitution. It ensures that the will of the American people is heard through laws written by their elected representatives. As a former judge, I agree that the power and responsibility of interpreting the law belongs to the courts, not unelected government bureaucrats. The clearer the law, the easier it is for judges to faithfully and accurately apply and interpret the law. Congress, therefore, has a renewed call to assert its legislative authority and write clear and precise laws. Dr. Kosar, I'd like to begin with you. You have written extensively about Congress establishing a Congressional Regulatory Office, which would likely be a longer-term project for us to undertake for the interim, or in the case where Congress chooses not to establish a permanent office. How can Congress strike a balance with its role in the rulemaking process that leverages agency expertise while maintaining strict legislative oversight and accountability?
Well, in the short term, if you can't get the purse strings loose enough to do a little pilot, say within the CBO, to test it out, particularly say within an issue area of real concern, you can try to draw upon the existing legislative branch folks more aggressively. I spent 10 years at the Congressional Research Service. I don't recall once in the thousands of requests I got, a member saying to me, hey, there's this proposed rule in your issue area. What do you make of it? Can you at least write me a memo and explain to me what this means and whether I should be concerned about the extent of the regulation, whether it's proper? That would be one means.
And you just touched on what I really was interested in as my next question, which is how can we better facilitate meaningful collaboration between lawmakers, legislative staff, and then agency experts to really draw upon all of that collective experience during the legislative drafting process?
Yeah, the drafting process. Well, I think the drafting process in many instances has been bedeviled because there's not a regular order being followed. You know, bills are being slapped together with a lot of other bills. You guys are being called to the floor and told it's time to vote on the rule, and please line up by party and don't scuttle things. Reorienting, getting back to a more regular process where committees are in the seat, and when committees report out a bill, those things get preference on the calendar, would allow a process by which you could be more deliberative and you could draw more on the expertise that's already available to you and get it in there.
Mr. Cruz, as you know, in 2023, the Biden administration released Executive Order 14094, which raises the threshold for which regulations are considered highly significant and drastically increased regulatory costs. How would you compare the Biden administration's approach to regulatory action with that of the previous administration?
Well, the Trump administration was defined by basically a regulatory cost budget. The one in, two out mechanism put that into place, and according to the data released, it worked. You could say there was low-hanging fruit there, and once you got rid of some low-hanging costly regulations, it was hard to do others. But things have changed with respect to Biden in the sense of, we used to consider a regulation economically significant if it was $100 million. That term has completely disappeared. If you go onto the OIRA website now and go to the database of rules and regulations in the Unified Agenda, the term is completely wiped out and it's replaced with Section 3F1 significant rules. It's not as poetic anymore. But you can still find those $100 million major rules purely thanks to the majorly bipartisan Congressional Review Act. So you guys still have something that you can sink your teeth into with respect to tracking major rules and some of these other projects you were indicating with respect to looking back. And I can tell you the new Unified Agenda came out late again, as we were discussing earlier with the new Unified Agenda came out, and you would expect that with 200 million threshold that the numbers of rules would come down a good bit that were at S3F1. You would expect that to occur, but no. In this current push, the CRA gives an incentive to an outgoing administration or potentially outgoing administration, because it's an election year, to jack up the number of rules, and that's exactly what we saw. So in the new Unified Agenda, there's a big jump in $200 million rules above what you might have expected, but you still need to monitor the ones that are beneath that level as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. De-Esposito is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, or I guess now good afternoon, everyone. Something that members do not regularly do is participate in the formal comment period for a rule. Should members of Congress or the chairs and ranking members of committees file comments during the notice and comment period of a rule to express their disagreement or even agreement with the contents and direction of the rule? It's really open for all of you.
I think this is an incredibly undervalued tool for members, and I, for the life of me, don't understand why members don't more frequently. In my time on the Hill, I encouraged members to participate in the process. There was maybe, and I don't want to speak for members of Congress, but it felt like that's for the public, we're not the public, and so it's beneath us, maybe. I may be overstating that, but I don't think you should see that as the case. I mean, this is the agency receiving all input, and by the way, courts would put a fair amount of deference to what members of Congress say, especially members of a committee of jurisdiction, and saying, this looks like what we asked you to do, or this doesn't look like, or we hope you consider these factors.
Mr. Cruz?
I would just say this is a little bit of a chance to maybe squeak something in, because there's been a lot of talk today about expertise, and I would submit to you that what agencies provide is not always expertise. A free market doesn't just mean companies go out and do whatever they want. You've got businesses, you've got upstream suppliers, downstream business customers, media, advertisers, consumers, all these forces that regulate, so to speak, businesses that potentially misbehave, and you don't want to just jump in with a regulation if you're undermining the other kinds of disciplines that emerge. Companies don't operate in a vacuum. They have all of those forces. And part of the free enterprise system is creating not just the new product or service, but also the disciplinary measures that go alongside. And I would submit to you that a lot of expertise on AI is not in agencies. The expertise with respect to allocating drone traffic in airspace does not exist at agencies. So part of your commentary, if you take up that kind of a project, would be to challenge the notion of expertise, which is also going to play into the notion of a Congressional Office of Regulatory Analysis too.
Anybody else?
Yes, I would just say that absolutely, I absolutely, again, agree with this fellow. But the real trick is being able, not just able to send it in, but having the knowledge base to deal with this stuff. I mean, pull out the Federal Register and you start looking at these regs and your eyes glaze over, your head hurts. I mean, there's just no way, unless you just happen to have somebody in your office or working for your committee, that you can meaningfully comment on this. This would take weeks and weeks and weeks to study, like this HUD rule that I'm looking at here. 22 to 28 pages, just the proposed notice.
So to that point, GAO has written about a potential new legislative branch known as the Office of Legal Counsel. You in favor of that? Do you think that that could help with this process? And I guess, could anybody explain what you think that would look like?
Sure, briefly, yeah, I read that report, and I guess it depends on how you view the challenge of legislators meaningfully participating. If it's, well, we need to draft better, we need to be more precise, so we don't inadvertently delegate authority away, yes, that could be quite helpful. But when it comes to the substantive knowledge of the issue area and the ability to double check the numbers that executive agencies give when they do the benefit cost analysis and say, hey, this reg is going to be wonderful for America, you don't have anything. And I'm not sure that sort of knowledge would rest in the Legislative Counsel office.
I would tag on to that just briefly. I would generally support anything that increases congressional capacity. And if I can reference the ranking member's comment about the inability to add on appropriations and staff, and also his penchant for love it or list it. I'm more of a say yes to the dress kind of guy, but the point of the shows, I think, is that we look for reasonable opportunities for improvement. GAO already has a statutory role as part of the Congressional Review Act. CBO has a number of analysts, and they have a mechanism for analyzing specific proposals. Those things exist even short of a whole new committee or a whole new office or 2,000 new staff.
My time's just about expired. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This concludes our questions. I thank all of our witnesses today. It's been a really interesting conversation about how we prepare to structure Congress in a post-Chevron doctrine world. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask that you please respond to those questions in writing. I'll also submit written testimony from Doug Holtz-Eakin, President of the American Action Forum, and from Marcy Harris of PopVox into the record. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to insert additional material into the record or to revise and extend their remarks. If there's no further business, I thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.